All right, I'm gonna start, and welcome. I want to thank Flags and especially McRuer for putting together this wonderful conference. Welcome to the only panel that has disability in the title. Not a criticism, just an observation. My name is Robert McRuer. I'm a professor of English at George Washington University, where I teach disability studies, queer theory, critical theory more generally. A lot about Crip theory, a book called that. And my forthcoming book this summer is called Disability Revolution. I'm going to introduce all panelists, and then we'll go in the order of the program and hopefully have time for Q&A. So, all right. They've asked me to just read the first part of the bios and direct you to the online program where you can read the full bios. Oops. So our first speaker is Alyssa Davis, and Alyssa Davis, she, they, is a Southern Gothic queer writer, research creator, and graduate student of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Alyssa will be followed by Clayton Jarrard, who is a graduate student at New York University's XE, Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement Interdisciplinary Program, where he is earning a master's in interdisciplinarity and an advanced certificate in experimental writing. Then we have two co-presenters. The first on that team is Angie Wootton. Angie Wootton is an assistant professor of social welfare and affiliated faculty of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Albany, SUNY. Angie is presenting with one time. Try any last thing. Do you have a bio in the program?
No, it's very possible. I forgot to see the bio.
Okay.
With Dr. Elliot. Dr. Elliot Tetreault, English department at the State University of New York at Albany. And also an affiliate of women's gender and sexuality studies. Thank you.
And then our final presenter is Justin Huwe. Justin Huwe is a second-year PhD student in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. So I'm going to hand this to Alyssa, who is going to speak from the book.
All righty, my name is Alyssa Davis, and this is Between Crip Time and Workfare Time, Queering Disability Legibility in the Welfare State. Transcranial magnetic stimulation. The term carries an almost sci-fi sheen, futuristic fix for a mind labeled unproductive, unmotivated, or unruly. Until you find yourself in the chair, and the future arrives not with a leap forward, but with a calendar crowded with appointments. Every day of TMS, I settled into the padded chair as a mechanical woodpecker tapped out Morse code against my skull. The sound is relentless. The sensation is numbing, but also strangely intimate, as if even the hope of relief is a disciplinary drill. Accessing TMS started to feel less like a glimpse of tomorrow and more like a very specific part-time job. Sit, repeat, and surrender your calendar for 6 to 8 weeks. To access a treatment designed to render me more employable, I must first have the financial privilege to make room for a daily 2-month treatment schedule that few traditional workers could realistically maintain. This is the paradox of workfare time. The system demands that I be disabled enough to require intervention, yet still have the capacity to submit to the rigid tempo of its delivery. It asks for the punctuality and consistency of an ideal worker from a body already marked as unfit for work. Nurses informed me that the relief provided by TMS is not always sustained, and some individuals require additional rounds of treatment. If the benefits diminish, obtaining further treatment necessitates navigating insurance protocols for a second time, which may require documented evidence of prior improvement on the first round. Specifically, insurance providers might demand proof, often through the PHQ-9 depression screener, that you have improved significantly enough to justify continued coverage. Embedded in that questionnaire is a fantasy of diagnostic neatness. It assumes that symptoms begin or belong to only one condition at a time. Symptoms can be clearly attributed. Symptom change can be linearly measured. But I navigate several different diagnoses at the same time. My body is an entangled ecosystem. So when the PHQ-9 asks if I'm feeling tired, have little energy, or am having trouble concentrating, it asks me to translate a messy, multi-layered existence into a disembodied report of singular suffering or recovery. The form wordlessly demands a kind of diagnostic purification. Which slice of this exhaustion is depression? Which slice is idiopathic hypersomnia? Which slice is the ADHD? As if I could separate them with a scalpel and label each one. This creates a dangerous double bind of legibility. If I answer the screener holistically and score my results high, my physical autoimmune symptoms risk being pathologized and dismissed as having been just the depression. But if I attempt to purify my answers, subtracting the fatigue of my arthritis and ADHD to leave only the depression, I won't score high enough to qualify for the psychiatric treatment I actually need. So to be served by the system, I must first perform the fiction of being a simple patient. I must tell a statistical story that the system can read, even if vital parts of my lived experience are edited out. Of course, this issue extends far beyond TMS or the PHQ-9. It reflects a broader systemic preoccupation with rendering bodies legible, often irrespective of the associated costs. So this talk follows that demand for legibility across 3 sites. First, clinical legibility, the demand to translate lived experience and symptoms into standardized data points or diagnostic categories. Second, administrative disability, or legibility, excuse me. The demand that disability be not only lived, but documented, verified, and re-verified across institutions. Third, temporal legibility. The demand that the volatile rhythms of a disabled body-mind align with the standardized timelines, schedules, and expectations of progress. Together, these 3 forms of legibility shape how disability becomes readable, governable, and unevenly survivable within the welfare state. My central argument is that the welfare state does not merely misunderstand Crip time. It demands that disabled and queer people translate nonlinear, entangled lives into bureaucratic forms of evidence. When our bodies cannot perform the right type of diagnostic purity on demand, illness becomes class vulnerability, lost wages, denied treatment, debt, and foregone benefits. If screeners like the PHQ-9 ask claimants to purify our symptoms, then the US Social Security Administration's Blue Book, formerly titled the Listing of Impairments, expands that demand to entire disabilities. James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State helps name the political logic behind this kind of classification document. Scott argues that modern states govern by simplifying complex realities into administratively readable forms. To see like the state, then, is to approach the body not as a lived complexity, but as something to be surveyed, partitioned, classified, and managed. To the state, legibility operates as a civilizing mission. In a similar way as colonial systems that once sought to map and purify populations to make them more easily governable, the Social Security Administration uses the listings of impairment, the Blue Book, as a grammar through which disabled life must be rendered. Power creates the conditions of readability. The state operationalizes that power through administrative systems. Those systems sort bodies according to what can be stabilized, documented, and narrated. Santiago Castro Gomez helps us clarify what kind of power is at stake here. The issue isn't just that the state simplifies, but that it mistakes its own simplification for universal truth. When the state presents as a natural classification, is better understood as an afterlife of what Castro Gomez calls 0-point hubris, the Enlightenment dream of a Western rationality that positions itself as some universal disembodied authority, as though institutions could observe the world from nowhere and therefore classify it without distortion. Read this way, the Blue Book does not simply describe disability. It can be understood as participating in a longer colonial project of producing administratively legible subjects through classification, simplification, and epistemic hierarchy. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Blue Book description of acceptable evidence. Its introduction describes medical evidence as the cornerstone of disability determination and places the ongoing responsibility for supplying that evidence on the claimant. To establish a medically determinable impairment, the SSA requires objective medical evidence from an acceptable medical source and explicitly states that a claimant's own statement of symptoms standing alone is not enough. This cornerstone is built on an epistemic hierarchy that privileges objective metrics such as laboratory findings over the subjective realities of pain, fatigue, or malaise. This hierarchy creates a credibility gap where the body must be verified by a third-party observer to be considered real. Under Section 14, that credibility gap takes a very specific form. Here, the Blue Book says that to support an immune system disorder claim, SSA generally needs a medical history, a physical examination, laboratory findings, and sometimes imaging or biopsy reports. It also says that when evaluating functioning, it looks to the frequency and duration of manifestations, periods of exacerbation and remission, and the impact of treatment. However, the medical documentation required to prove those repeated flares is logistically difficult to gather. When my sleep specialist at Duke says the soonest appointment is 14 months away, how should I ensure my symptoms peak next year at that time? If a patient is too ill to attend an appointment during a flare, the severity is not recorded and therefore unverifiable to the state. If they do manage to attend during a period of remission, the clinical notes may describe them as appearing in no acute distress, a phrase that frequently triggers an administrative denial. This means the claimant must perform punctuality, availability, and coherence on demand, often during very challenging times in their illness. Clinical legibility is concerned with evidence at the level of the body-mind, symptoms, test results, everything I mentioned. Administrative legibility focuses on the bureaucratic afterlife of that evidence, how it is processed, rechecked, and sometimes avoided by missing paperwork, mismatching records, or institutional delay. Pamela Hurd and Donald Moynihan in Administrative Burden theorized three kinds of costs that people often face when accessing public services: learning costs, compliance costs, and psychological costs. For my purposes here, compliance costs are especially important. What disability bureaucracy demands is not just evidence, but maintenance. You can already be documented, already be known, already be sick, and still have that recognition weakened, suspended, or voided, unless you continually maintain it through re-verification. This matters because a person might be visibly struggling, medically documented, and institutionally known in fragments, but still be unsupported because that recognition does not travel clearly across the programs or remain intact across time. Disability becomes something that must be kept procedurally alive. I myself have encountered that instability many times. Vocational rehabilitation has already recognized me as disabled enough to fund my graduate tuition in the name of improving my employability. That determination exists in writing. It has legal and material consequences, but that recognition does not travel to the SSA or to SNAP, where I must once again gather documentation to prove my disability. This siloing forces the disabled person to perform the labor of the messenger, constantly reshuttling the same proofs between agencies. Each agency runs its own legibility gauntlet from scratch as if the previous adjudication hadn't happened. And queer and trans lives can make this even harder to navigate. I use the term queer Crip legibility to name the pressure to make an entangled life administratively intelligible within systems that presume stable impairments, linear timelines, coherent medical histories, and normatively ordered bodies. But what's important is that what gets excluded is not just episodic disability, but other forms of embodiment and social life that exceed cis heteronormative expectations about how a body should develop, function, and be documented. Dean Spade writes in his book, Trans Politics and the Limits of Law, I met an endless stream of people facing a series of interlocking problems related to being basically unfathomable to the administrative systems that govern the distribution of life chances. SSA's own records infrastructure make that friction visible. As of January 2026, the agency states that it is not updating the sex field on the new mident, even while insisting that sex markers should not determine benefit eligibility. That contradiction matters. It shows how gender variance can persist inside a system as a data problem, producing mismatch and scrutiny, even where the formal policy says that it should not. Gender variance becomes legible to the state as a data problem, a field that cannot be updated, not as a person's reality. Seen this way, career class is not incidental to disability legibility, but helps structure who can survive the cost of becoming legible at all. A 2024 Center for American Progress found that disabled LGBTQIA people face elevated risks of poverty, discrimination, and barriers to care. While a 2022 study of disabled adults found that transgender respondents were almost 3 times more likely than cisgender respondents to report at least one unmet healthcare need. The burden of administration compliance then lands hardest on the people already navigating economic precarity, institutional misrecognition, and the intensified time costs of staying legible. But of course, again, these costs are not simply economic or administrative, they are also temporal. Alison Kafer in Feminist Queer Crip defines Crip time as the bending of the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds, rather than forcing disabled bodies into normative timelines. Kafer also explicitly links Crip time to Jack Halberstam's account of queer time in A Queer Time and Place, where queer time names non-normative temporalities that emerge outside bourgeoisie scripts of reproduction, inheritance, and life progression. Thank you. Disability studies work on Crip time foregrounds how disabled life often entails nonlinear rhythms, uneven capacities, long recovery tails, and of course, that's the opposite of the state's demands. An interesting example of this in particular is the fact that many lawyers will not take a disability case until after you have already gotten a denial, because they are paid from past due benefits if and when a claimant is awarded benefits, essentially incentivizing the process to take longer and for someone to come on board to actually provide help and support later in the process. Between Crip time and Workfare time, what emerges is not a neutral administrative gap, but a politics of survival. When support is conditioned on diagnostic purity, administrative coherence, and temporal compliance, complexity itself becomes a site of dispossession. If we want a more just world, then the task is not just to make disabled and queer lives more obediently intelligible to the state, not when systems remain in place so that the consequences for failing to be legible are material. Lost care, lost income, lost time, and intensified precarity. Because the measure of a just system is not how efficiently it sorts people, but whether people can remain complex and still live. Thank you.
Right, can everybody hear me okay?
I would speak into the microphone.
So I'd love to start off by thanking the organizers who have labor to make it possible for us to gather today. I'm also very grateful and excited to be in conversation with this panel. To dive in, my paper is titled Pathologizing Sin. the Pastoral-Psychiatric Collaboration in American Bourgeois Authority. So in this paper, I'm interrogating white liberalism's progressive arrangements at the turn of the 20th century US as a moment in the consolidation and normalization of American bourgeois or ruling class authority and its regimes of regulation. This research seeks to trace some of the seams and folds between Protestant pastoral care and mental hygiene psychiatry as they materialized a new economy of interiority for everyday American life. Revolving around only 3 individuals, a pastor, a psychiatrist, and a young queer person, my central case study threads a unique alignment of relations of power and knowledge that yield valuable granularities of class, disability, and queer politics in the settler US. So through historical research in this archival case study in the 1920s New York City, I'm investigating the material arrangements and normativities erecting disability as a category of abnormality to engage a mad queer history of psychiatry in the US. Through this paper, I emphasize Psy authority, PSY authority, following Regina Kunzel's framing that distinctions between theories, methodologies, and treatments were not the primary concern for many on the receiving end of psychiatric power, especially when these encounters were frequently non-voluntary. By using the term madness to encompass descriptors like mentally ill, antisocial, perverse, and deviant, I endeavor to place pressure on pathologization and diagnosis as tools of a broader regime of white bourgeois authority invested in a normalizing ideology of health, and this was a very eugenic project. Psy authority was brought to the masses largely through the mental hygiene movement, a reformulation of psychiatry into a public health-like approach throughout the early to mid-20th century. In less than 2 centuries, American psychiatry went from a few asylum superintendents sharing methods for managing madness to an entire psy-industrial complex that permeates everyday life. Consulting the archive of American mental hygiene opens a space to consider how and why psy authority came to be wielded outside of the asylum to manage and discipline the public. I begin by offering a brief history of mental hygiene through the career of the influential psychiatrist Dr. Thomas W. Salmon. I follow this with an overview of Protestant pastoral counseling's concurrent development through the ministry of Reverend Harry Emerson Fosdick. Finally, I explored the impetus of their collaboration, a homosexual case, in quotes, to question how the synergies between white Protestant Christianity and science erected regimes of regulation for racial hygiene. So, part 1, the state psychiatrist. After decades of propagating asylums and their internal systems of scientific medical management, the turn of the 20th century became a time of crisis for the discipline of psychiatry. Psychiatry could not live up to its aspirations to cure and successfully reintegrate institutionalized patients, and I'm using patients critically, into broader society. So, desperate to legitimize its status as a medical science, psychiatry redirected its attention from cure to prevention and early intervention in the public, employing the name mental hygiene. One champion for this redeployment of psychiatry was Dr. Thomas Salmon. Salmon worked in state hospitals as a bacteriologist before he began managing psychiatric evaluations for the New York immigration system. In this work, he formalized the use of diagnostic categories for tracking patient statistics in state hospitals and pioneered a standardized system of reporting admissions and discharges. These were subsequently adopted nationally through Salmon's roles as director for the National Committee for Mental Hygiene and as president for the American Psychiatric Association. In these positions, Salmon paved the way for state agencies, policy initiatives, and child guidance offices to bring Psy authority to everyday settings outside the asylum. Importantly, psychiatry and mental hygiene gained cultural purchase by medicalizing what they called the moral decay perceived to be threatening society's order, security, and progress. One of the original members of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, psychologist William James, saw the training of good habits to be a critical application of psychology for conserving society's established order. Salmon's close colleague Adolf Meyer envisioned mental hygiene as training individuals' thinking and habits to embrace their respective positions within a stratified population. Mental hygiene figured mental health as a personal achievement, but within the limits of both an individual's biomedical endowment and within the individual's racial class position. In this frame, members of subordinated groups could only achieve mental health if they internalized beliefs that social inequality reflected the natural order of things. Part 2, the bourgeois pastor. At the turn of the 20th century, psychiatry's bid for legitimacy as a scientific medicine was accomplished by advancing white supremacist and colonial norms of a healthy mind, which relied upon naturalizing white Protestantism as, quote, rational, restrained, orderly, and contributing to the public good, according to the historical work of Judith Weisenfeld. In fact, it was white Protestant pastors who would help usher psychiatry outside of the asylum. A nationally prominent New York City pastor during this time, Reverend Harry Emerson Fosdick's ministry rallied middle and upper class white Christians under the banner of the social gospel, a progressive movement seeking to reform the accumulating social issues of modernity by imbuing economic and social life with Christian ethics while partnering with corporations and government. Fosdick published widely, advocating for social justice and civil liberties, yet he also ambivalently embraced eugenics and rubbed shoulders with the rich and powerful. In the early 1920s, while at First Presbyterian Church, Fosdick began holding private conferences with congregants to discuss the issues of their individual lives. Fosdick wrote of this time, quote, "The intelligent minister who really cared about his people could not escape the demand for organized personal counseling when psychiatry was making it every day a more widely recognized means of service to individuals," end quote. By incorporating psi authority into the pastoral ministry, Protestant judgments of suffering and sinfulness came to evolve with scientific explanations of deviance and illness. Fosdick would gain renown for his counseling ministry, cementing his name as an indispensable figure in the emerging psi-inflected pastoral care movement. However, Fosdick's initial turn to pastoral consultation proved more intense than anticipated. Like most, if not all, of his colleagues in the ministry, he had received no formal training in pastoral care while at seminary. So out of his depth, Fosdick turned to the psychiatrist he had met through the Rockefeller Foundation, Dr. Thomas W. Salmon. Part 3, the Pastoral-Psychiatric Collaboration. This began Reverend Fosdick and Dr. Salmon's partnership. The pastor and the psychiatrist collaborated for years on counseling sessions that came through the church, a relationship Fosdick would call a friendship. The two referred their, quote, patients to one another, and Fosdick credited Salmon's instruction for teaching him to practice a diagnostic process and create psychological case histories for who he called his patients, which were just his congregants. Despite their different areas of expertise, Fosdick and Salmon held many precepts in common, and their partnership honed a collaborative approach animated by the synergies underpinning liberal Protestantism and mental hygiene psychiatry. The crescendo of Fosdick and Salmon's collaboration was to be a clinic operated by the pair at Riverside Church. In their envisioned clinic, Fosdick would minister to the spiritual needs of patients while Salmon treated their psychic needs. Both Fosdick and Salmon declared the need for such a partnership where psychiatry could benefit from the moral and spiritual guidance of Christianity, while pastoral ministry was supplemented with scientific understandings and treatments. However, their vision did not come to fruition. Salmon unexpectedly died in 1927 before the clinic could be constructed. Fosdick and Salmon are staples in histories of pastoral care and psychiatry, respectively. But their cross-disciplinary collaboration, and the many others like theirs, has garnered little attention. The lively connection between Fosdick and Salmon, their seemingly seamless coalescence of vision, illuminates a symbiotic relationship between Protestant Christianity and psychiatry. Yet holding even greater significance was the occasion for their collaboration, homosexuality. Part 4, the pastor, the psychiatrist, and the homosexual case. So the, quote, homosexual case, as Fosdick referred to the person, that drove Reverend Fosdick to seek psychiatric expertise arrived on one of the first days of his private consultations. The fullest account that I have found reads as follows, quote, "Doubtless I had heard that there was such a disease as homosexuality, but never knowingly had I met a homosexual, so that when a humiliated youth came to me with that problem, or something that looked like it, involved in his distressing situation, I knew that I must have help," end quote. This startling account of homosexuality opened Fosdick's 1942 book on psi-informed pastoral care called On Being a Real Person. Importantly, between the 1930s and 50s, American psychiatry was entering what's been called its golden age, and attempts to cure homosexuality were a pivotal force for psychiatry's uptake. Fosdick's account of counseling a, quote, homosexual in 1942 was one of the earliest mentions, if not the earliest, of homosexuality in the corpus of literature and pastoral counseling. And a wave of white liberal Protestant pastoral counselors would follow Fosdick. While these pastors varied in their understandings of how homosexuality was a pathology, they all accepted it as a pathology nonetheless. This use of psi authority by Protestant leaders were propelled by the very pathologization of homosexuality as a biomedical pathology for curative intervention. Importantly, in the turn of the 20th century New York City, specifically in working class communities, a complex sex-gender system existed where people could engage in various sexual activities without the pressure of essentialist identifications. The predominantly immigrant working class culture's allowances for gender and sexual plasticity posed a threat to white bourgeois sociality and was condemned as antisocial. Significantly, First Presbyterian Church, where Fosdick began his counseling ministry, was located in Greenwich Village, which is known as kind of a vibrant queer subculture throughout the 20th century. Although it would become known as the first white middle-class gay subculture in the city, George Chauncey documents that this moment in the 1920s was the beginning of bourgeois regimes of authority, doctors, scientists, police, judges, and, in my case, pastors, attempting to regulate queer socialities through criminalization and pathologization, namely under the label of homosexuality. Homosexuality as a diagnosis funneled a diverse erotic economy into a single illness. In the same move, non-productive and non-reproductive social forms were packaged as biomedical abnormalities. Mental hygiene's emphasis on achieving health according to individual endowment grafted pathology onto racialized and classed bodies and socialities while naturalizing the social and material conditions that made these pathologies broadly acceptable. Examining how queerness was embedded within homosexuality as a biomedical pathology, I'm reminded of J. Logan Smilge's observation that, quote, disability is a technique of queers' incarceration. Considering forces like the creation of ugly laws in the late 19th and early 20th century, alongside this rise of regimes of regulating queer, immigrant, and working class socialities at the turn of the 20th century, bourgeois authority can be seen as imposing a material privation on the abnormal body and mind for racial hygiene, witnessed, for example, in the inaccessibility of public life for disabled people and in the secrecy enforced through the spatial metaphor of the closet. Beginning in the 1920s, a greater control of queerness through the pathologization of homosexuality emerged as part of the bourgeois assertion for authority over interiority. Similar to Madness's interior confinement in a biomedical model of mental illness, queerness was decontextualized from the local socialities it emerged within to stable homosexuality as deviance, legible through racialized, colonial, and classed understandings of the mind. As psi authority developed outside the asylum, promulgated by racism, colonialism, and class violence, Protestant pastors were a primary driver of naturalizing its legitimacy. This was about racial hygiene. Arising in America from genocidal settler and enslaver institutions, eugenics at this time was accumulating towards the fascism of the Second World War. Diagnosis was one consequence of the pastor shepherding individuals and congregations into the realm of psi authority, and enshrining homosexuality as a pathology enabled new technologies of surveillance, management, and abstraction, while uplifting eugenics through social reform and liberal sensibilities across the church, the clinic, the state, and beyond. Thank you.
Sorry.
Are we supposed to share our screen? Who's in?
You want?
This might be just audio recording.
You're doing it for the room, right? Yeah.
Right. Hello and welcome to both those in person and those on the live stream. This talk is called The Labor of Community Care, Affordances and Limitations of Professionalism for LGBTQ plus Peer Mental Health Support. We are a team of Professor Pals from upstate New York and happy to be here today. I'm Dr. Angie Wootton. I'm an assistant professor of social welfare and affiliated faculty of women's gender and sexuality studies. These are some images that represent a bit about my positionality. And I think an important thing to mention as well is that I'm a practicing social worker, and I come from a background where I have often worked within professional mental health settings alongside people who are labeled as peers or people of lived experience. And oftentimes working on these teams of mixed professional and peers, but with the recognition that there was a lot of overlap between those who were considered professionals of lived experience who might not have been out as such, including me, and those who were specifically employed due to their experiences of disability and the ability to tell stories about that. So that really shapes the way I see this work, having been an insider-outsider for many years in that space.
Hi, I'm Elliot Tetreault, Associate Professor of English and Affiliate Faculty of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at SUNY Albany. So I am not in the field of social work or mental health. I'm an English professor and a rhetoric scholar, but I'll talk a bit more later about how I sort of came to this, other than just like being friends with Angie. But yeah, I have wrote a book, which I didn't bring with me, Angie brought with me. Because Angie's now my publicist. If you're interested, it just came out in September from Ohio State University Press, Truth Be Told, White Nostalgia and Anti-Racist Queer Resistance in Post-Truth America. So yeah, what I have studied is, rhetoric is my field and what my PhD is in, queer studies, queer cultural production and media, queer history and historiography, and also, like writing studies. So yeah.
All right, so what we're talking about today is a very small slice of a larger project called LGBTQ Solace, which is for support, opportunities for learning, and community empowerment. This is a community-engaged, community-based participatory research and action project in upstate New York, about 130 miles up the Hudson River. And we are working to research and build LGBTQ plus peer mental health support capacity. So through educational opportunities, job training opportunities, and just simply being together, telling our stories and being in support. We do this work. This current phase of the work really centers the experiences of sexual minority women or queer women, said very broadly. If you feel a part of that world, you are welcome, with an eye to expand into the future, but knowing that that is where my work is historically focused. So I came to this work because during the COVID pandemic, I was doing LGBTQ community mental health research at that time. And there were a lot of calls for increased peer support and mutual aid that came out of queer thinking in the pandemic from some of the scholars that we list here, among others. And being a social worker and an action-oriented person, my thought was, what are we doing to build capacity? What are we doing to meet these community calls and to actually help us build the things that we want to build? And so that led to a line of work that I do related to LGBTQ peer support capacity. So the idea is that there has been a lack of accessible, affirming, and adequate professional help within mental health for LGBTQ plus people, despite a lot of expansions recently with evidence-based practice for queer folks. So the idea is that we support us. We always have and we always will. And there are ways that we can do this more skillfully and more effectively with the right tools and opportunities and training and support. And we see LGBTQ peer support as a site of both queer possibility and sites of labor. This is work. This is actual work. And so we think about what it means to have folks supporting each other or put into these roles from an economic perspective, as well as a community building perspective of what does it take to do the labor of supporting us, especially when we think about the number of folks that are coming from both lived experience of having challenges and also simultaneously supporting people through challenges. And the idea that formalizing care work, that things like mental health support or crisis intervention or suicide prevention support are things that LGBTQ plus people have been doing informally for each other for forever. And there's also a possibility for making that into paid labor. There are now opportunities to formalize this into peer work, and that can lead to economic opportunities and class mobility for folks who've otherwise been really shut out of traditional employment. But that comes with some trade-offs in terms of having to look respectable or certain things that are expected when you become a professional within these fields. So we'll talk about one aspect of peer mental health support, which is the idea of embodied storytelling. This is one of many aspects of peer support. We also do crisis intervention. We do informal counseling. We do access to resources. But one of the big things we think about is the way that people are hired and kept on staff to tell stories of their disability, their struggles, their recovery.
So yeah, as I said, I come to this as a rhetoric scholar, and specifically thinking also my training in like radical writing studies pedagogies. And so I really have been thinking a lot about this idea about, storytelling being one among many things that happens in like a peer support context. But this, the ability to listen and enter into dialogue with one another's stories and then sort of retroactively, reflexively on one's own is not automatic, right? Like that is actually a skill, even though that's something that is often maybe assumed to be automatic. Or assumed to be something that you might know just because of having some kind of marginalized experience. But, I really wanted to highlight that this kind of storytelling, sort of embodied storytelling, experiential storytelling in peer support environments is, something that requires rhetorical and pedagogical skill, especially this idea of what I'm terming relational rhetorical awareness, which means not just like say how one is crafting or performing one story for a passive audience, but instead how one is, entering into a relational view of a storytelling as meaning making. So this really would foreground meaning being made through the interaction with others, stories as things that transform instead of static things that you share. And also the idea of receptive listening and inquiry, those are like learned rhetorical skills, again, something that is not automatic. So really, thinking about this as a really often sort of overlooked or taken for granted practice emphasizes like the craft, the labor, and the care work of storytelling. And especially, this comes from Joe Su, who thinks about the idea that, in a world that is really engineered for our isolation, right? We do not learn community skills, most people in the day-to-day, right? These are things that are not prioritized. We learn skills of individualism and competition, or if we learn to, tell stories or tell personal narratives, it's from a very individualist framing. But instead, this part of a sort of broader view of kinship building, reframing storytelling as that requires a whole different set of skills. So it's also, necessary, I think, about how storytelling exists in this broader context, especially for the telling and hearing of marginalized stories. So like how they are told and how they are heard, and how that also affects the telling. So one of those, parts of that context is this just idea of commodification of marginalized stories, the ease with which certain stories of marginalized experience of queerness, disability, race, etc., are really co-opted and sort of assimilated into a commodity form, in capitalist culture. There's this sort of valorization of self-expression to a certain degree in this individualist context. And sometimes valoration of self-expression sort of at the cost of collective action. So, repetitions to like tell your story or share your story, right? Don't always lead to collectivity. And there's also sometimes a built-in assumption that healing can come through disclosure alone, or sort of a confessional model, rather than through practices of community care and relational accountability. Another risk, this comes from disability justice scholar and organizer Mia Mingus, is the risk of forced intimacy, or people being sort of forced into kind of inauthentic form of intimacy or pressure with each other without the setup of adequate practices, skills, and support structures. And in terms of the listening and hearing component, there's also really subtle pressures that can even shape the telling of a story that one might not be aware of, right? Like subtle pressures to sort of script one's narrative into an expected form, like the overcoming adversity narrative, when that type of narrative disclosure is actually not, adequate to explain what that person's experience is. So instead, thinking about storytelling, embodied storytelling as a skill-based and relational practice really reframes how to think about the value of this labor, not transactional or exploitative at the worst. The idea of being sort of paid for one's story or to perform one's trauma, not for one's relational skills, but really honoring these forms of rhetorical labor and care work and skill that are often made invisible.
All right. So in building the work that we've done, this is kind of the beginning of the project. We've been at it for about a year and a half or so. And of course, there are more questions than answers as we figured out how do we want to build peer support training programs? How do we want to help folks get into that as a profession? How do we help folks decide whether to professionalize or whether to stay more unprofessional? Said lovingly, like please do if you want to. And so these are some questions that come to my mind as we built this project. And again, I don't have any great answers, but I think they're worth really considering carefully. If you are doing peer mental health support work or you are building programs that include that include things about the working conditions and safety for peer mental health support workers, especially those who are marginalized or queer. Including how equitable or fair are working conditions for peers versus professionals in mental health systems. I'll tell you, peers and professionals are treated really differently, and sometimes there is a big divergence in jobs, and sometimes there is not. Big questions of equity in pay and in treatment. Are peers the only ones expected to self-disclose in these settings? Oftentimes they are, which puts them in a very distinct role compared to those who are professionals and allowed to hold distance from their own lived experience, even if they do have lived experience. Are peers required to tell their stories certain ways, or do they have control over their narratives? The pressure to perform a recovery story that is inspiring and beautiful, even when it might be more complex or more messy. Will peers get support if their storytelling is disabling or destabilizing? The idea that these are some of the hardest things to talk about, and yet people are expected to do this over and over and over again with those who they may not have rapport with or trust with. So the question of will workers be supported if it is a challenge to do that work? And will peers be protected by others if others take and weaponize their stories, knowing that what is expected to share is often deeply, deeply personal and could be used to create harm against folks if not held carefully. Other questions include the economic value of peer support. The idea of, maybe this is a little bit severe, but what is telling one story worth to yourself and to others in US dollars an hour? How much would you need to be willing to tell your story? There's lots of stories I would tell you right now for free, and there are some stories you could not pay me anything to say on live stream. So if you think about this, and does storytelling feel like extracted labor from those who are struggling, or a mutually beneficial practice? And what does it mean that we've created systems where those who are struggling are being paid to support those of less means who are also struggling? Are there opportunities for peers to advance in the field? I have been watching this for years. The idea that people who are labeled as peers can get stuck and not have opportunities for advancement into professional lines. So the idea that you can get certified, but you will still arguably never make what a licensed mental health professional who also might be a peer truly at their root could make. So questions about whether folks are becoming stuck at a certain economic level. In conclusion, we don't have all the answers, but we think about this deeply. I recently did a scoping review paper on LGBTQ specific peer mental health support programs for adults. I found only 5 programs from the 70s to now that were truly doing this work, and there is not consensus on how to do this work. And so a lot of this is us sitting with these questions in hopes of creating ethical programs and ones that are highly intentional. And we acknowledge this is a highly limited scope in our little brief talk. And there's a lot more things we need to talk about, especially in terms of queering professionalism, what that even looks like, respectability and assimilation in mainstream mental health workforces. And then this really big logistical challenge of folks receiving disability benefits and also being paid for this labor, how that is balanced, because that can be extremely tenuous and complicated. And ideas about supervision and burnout, or what it means to do this work sustainably. So again, no big answers, but our field is actively trying to figure it out as we build the ship and sail it. Some acknowledgements as well to some folks who are walking the walk. The 2 folks I list here are doing work from a peer perspective with party and play communities in Toronto, telling some hard stories with a lot of realness and vulnerability. And I took some inspiration when thinking about this from an economic perspective from them. Thanks to our research and action team. Thanks to Flags for hosting. This is an image of one of our promo stickers. We have a lot of free promo stuff here, including tote bags, purple carabiners, cherry chapstick, and a lot of stickers. This is very queer culture relevant. So please help yourself if you're here in person. They are meant to be inspiring and to connect us. And we have references if you're into that kind of thing. Thanks for listening.
Well, I do not have any swag to give out. I do have some copies of the paper and images I'll be looking at if that's helpful with following along, if there's anyone who wants that. Do you want papers, images? I'll do them, yeah. I know, it's a long part. Yeah, of course. Anyone else? I can't promise that I'll follow exactly, but yeah.
Oh, wait, I thought it was for you.
Okay, let me just pull up my presentation and then we'll be good to go. There we go.
From the beginning.
Yeah.
Please take this flag.
Okay, so hello everyone, my name is Justin Huwe. I am a second-year PhD student at Columbia. Thank you so much for taking the time out of this gorgeous day to be here today. To my fellow panelists, to Robert for moderating this dynamic conversation. So I would like to round out the panel today by turning explicitly to the aesthetic. I'll be doing some close looking and visual analysis of some artwork by queer disabled artists working along the East Coast, mostly in New York City, including 2 photographers and a playwright actor. And in doing so, I'll be probing the terms of access specifically, and its relationship to questions of queerness and disability, intimacy and the erotic, hair and labor, as well as the possibilities of contemporary visual aesthetics. So to start, I'd like to ground us with some background on the language of access and how I'll be using it. Access as a conceptual term in disability studies indicates the removal of environmental barriers for those with impairments, often leading to changes in physical architecture and technology. Immutability as a term access allows this single word to indicate a variety of accommodations. Just to name a few examples, this could include lifts or widened bathroom stalls for wheelchair users, closed captions or ASL interpretation for folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, or masking guidelines in crowds to enable access for the immunocompromised. But accessibility can also refer to broader socioeconomic goals, access to healthcare, for example, or housing. As scholar Bess Williamson astutely puts it, quote, access implies social potential not dependent on correcting the disabled body, but instead made possible through institutional and material terms, end quote. How, though, I wonder, might we understand access not only through its spatial and material relations to the physical environment, but also, and maybe especially, through the erotic? Building on the work of queer disability theorists like Eli Clare, Topol Sieverts, Robert McRuer, who actually some of you might know, I did a great chapter on access in the collection Sex and Disability, which I'll be drawing from. But my research on contemporary art and performance seeks to ask these two questions. One, what is the place of pleasure and sex in conversations around access? And how does the erotic function as a site where the intimacies of care, labor, and desire are negotiated? And two, turning to the work of queer and disabled artists, what might be gained when we theorize accessibility, not as a way of making the present world more hospitable, but as foundational to opening up pathways to new worlds, ones which are wholly invested in access to pleasure for all. So in seeking to address these questions, I'd like to first turn to a photograph by queer disabled artist Joey Solomon. Featured in a recent Berlin exhibition titled Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer, Joey Solomon's 2019 photograph, pictured here, self-portrait with Robert Andy Coombs in my dorm room, depicts the queer embrace between Solomon and Coombs. And as a side note, Coombs is actually another photographer we'll be discussing in a moment, who has built a close relationship and collaborative practice with Solomon. And several things stick out to me about this image. First, the sheer sensuality of it. Coombs and Solomon's shirtless embrace is tender, layered with feelings of care and support, as erotic potential simultaneously swirls around the image of Coombs holding Solomon and the structure of his wheelchair. And yet their gazes, or lack thereof, tell a second story. Solomon stares directly into the camera, confronting the viewer with his queer disabled gaze, while Coombs shows a refusal to look at both Solomon and the camera, his eyes closed and head tilted down. Coombs's refusal to conjure a sense of vulnerability and privacy in tension with Solomon's indication of an audience with Coombs's refusal to conjure a sense of vulnerability and privacy is in tension with Solomon's indication of an audience with his direct gaze. He stares back at potential viewers head on, who might gawk at the moment of queer disabled sensuality, turning their gaze with his own. The camera angle makes it so that Solomon and the act of queer pleasure becomes elevated as he simultaneously looks down on the viewer, as non-mobility, an experience that non-mobility impaired people often do experience when standing next to people who are using wheelchairs. He orients the audience's gaze, playing with the politics of perspective. Their embrace, as I mentioned, is supported by the structure of a motorized wheelchair. The wheelchair becomes a site of multiple forms of access. Access, first and foremost, to a built environment that is often challenging to traverse for those with mobility impairments, but also access to the realm of same-sex erotic pleasure. Similar to how Coombs's body is supported by his wheelchair, he also supports Solomon's body with his, creating layers of support and interdependency. Furthermore, not only does the wheelchair facilitate the enactment of queer pleasure, but Solomon's photograph also queers dominant cultural narratives that stigmatize disabled people's sexuality, pushing back against desexualized characterizations of disabled people. As scholars Robert McRuer and Anna Malo note, there is, quote, a pervasive cultural de-eroticization of people with disabilities. Amidst this reality, Solomon lays bare a vision of sensuality inclusive of both homoerotic intimacy and disability. Ultimately, just to conclude here on this image, the black and white photo evokes for me a sense of timelessness and a rich emotion around queer disabled desire and care, this photograph allowing viewers access into this enduring intimacy. Building on this reading of access in Solomon's work, I'd like now to turn to a pair of Coombs's photographs from his recent Crip series. To offer some background, Coombs's photography also intentionally engages in a politics of visibility. His oft pornographic photos make queer disabled desire radically visible, portraying the intimate relationship Coombs holds with his lovers, as well as with his wheelchair and other medical care. Similarly to Solomon, his photographs stage queer intimacies not often portrayed in public, such as sex performed in a wheelchair juxtaposed alongside tender moments with his friends and partners. Solomon says, quote, "I make the images I wish existed, ones that showcase both the erotic potentials of interdependence in environments where queerness and disability need not be obscured." The two Coombs photographs I'm interested in today explicitly take up the intersections of labor, belonging, and desire. To start, let's consider the photo on the left here. We see Coombs sitting in his motorized wheelchair, a rainbow bandana wrapped around his neck, echoed by flashes of rainbow clothing throughout the image. This vibrant attire, coupled with the groups of people standing around, conjures for me the idea of a June Pride celebration in an urban area like New York City. However, Coombs' stern, serious gaze pierces through any feelings of celebration or revelry. Moreover, his hat casts his face in complete shadow, adding to the solemn mood. While everyone else is standing around, staring out into the street, Coombs looks directly into the camera, similar to Solomon. Once again, the queer disabled gaze is turned directly on the viewer. Looking at the photograph, there is a stark divide between Coombs and the background of Pride goers. They don't pay attention to him at all, their backs turned, and he rejects the spectacle of the Pride parade behind him, lacking an accessible vantage point from which to see the festivities. Instead, he turns the camera on himself, even as the other photographers behind him, which you can see on the side here, eagerly seek to capture the celebratory spectacle happening in parade. In particular, however, I'm struck by the social and economic backdrop of this photo. The modern Pride celebration in many cities has transformed from its origins in radical queer activism to an emblem of homonormativity, often beleaguered by the pressures of respectability politics, rampant consumerism, and the homogenizing force of able-bodied white cis men. However, atop the image, above all the rainbows, if you look close, are the American flag and the corporate logo of designer clothing brand Cole Haan. Both of these emblems haunt the photo, one the logo of a business and the other the logo of a staunchly capitalist nation. The status of the logo particularly interests me because it implies that consumerism quite literally always lurks in the background at such celebrations. Intriguingly, Cole Haan is actually described specifically in the fashion community as accessible luxury, meaning the photograph explicitly features an example of the language of accessibility being co-opted for consumerist purposes. All of these details coalesce for me into a powerful statement on the limits of modern-day consumer-oriented pride, a statement on who gets left out amidst a supposed ethos of inclusivity. Coombs' queer disabled body, while compositionally centered, is nevertheless rendered on the margins of the crowd. He appears small in relation to the mass of the crowd, only occupying the bottom 2/3 of the frame. Amidst the homonormative spectacle, Coombs' positioning in the photograph raises questions about who is actually included in this now deeply commodified celebration. Coombs' queer disabled embodiment renders him outside of the homonormative mainstream, despite its touting of inclusivity and diversity. Ultimately, I read the shadow that I mentioned that stretches across his face as reflecting the status of many queer disabled bodies in the shadows of such events. Many of the critical concerns observed in the left photo, however, stand in stark relief with the photo on the right. First, a sense of publicness in the left photos exchanged for the privacy of interior space, the space of the festival for a stone and concrete, subterranean feeling room. But this space offers many noticeable contrasts. Instead of being cast in shadow, for example, Solomon's face is now fully lit, donning a relaxed and confident expression. Once again, the queer disabled gaze remains central to the image, confronting the viewer. Unlike the left photo, his body now takes up the entire frame from top to bottom, the compositionally elevating Coombs as he sits on a throne of naked men. His motorized wheelchair from prior photos has been exchanged for a mass of bodies that touches him warmly on all sides, underscoring themes of interdependence, as well as the dueling valences of desire and labor that define care. Moreover, the specter of capitalist exclusion that defined the left photo is now replaced by the striking visibility of queer disabled subjectivity, quite literally bearing all in a forceful rejection of the political confines of respectability. The three men at his side stare at Coombs' naked body with desire in their eyes, sheer eroticism bathing the image, as we witness another kind of queer gaze. Like Solomon's photograph, the wheelchair once again becomes the site of erotic queer connection, this time made possible by the men who also take on roles of support and care. There's an undeniable threading of care and pleasure being displayed in how the men hold up Coombs, and also the care and pleasure with which Coombs sits atop them. But this does not come without the weight of care, most literally for the man whom Coombs sits upon. Scholar Rachel Adams' definition of care comes to mind here, particularly her emphasis on the relationship between care and labor. Caregiving is a form of work, she writes, and is also work to be cared for. Adams' definition strikes me for its mutuality. Put in conversation with the image, we can see that the question of labor and care need not be cleaved from our understanding of the erotic. Many intimacies are possible in this constellation of bodies: sexual, physical, emotional intimacies that hold the potential, I believe, to cross the boundaries of ability, class, and more. The aesthetic imaginings of Solomon and Coombs reconceptualize access in new modes beyond their typical discursive frameworks. To borrow an articulation by Tobin Siebers, quote, "If people with disabilities are to develop a sexual culture, they will need to access safe spaces where they may develop new erotic theories and modes of being," end quote. Ultimately, the aesthetic realm of photography functions as both a space to enact these new theories and modes, while also bridging the public-private dichotomy and visualizing modes of queer disabled relationality that are not often depicted. So to close, I would like to briefly anchor our discussion of intimacy by turning to a recent off-Broadway play, which I've been writing about and I wanted to include in this presentation, but isn't really a central focus of mine for this presentation, but I think it'll help us theorize the photographs. This recent off-Broadway play is by writer and actor Ryan J. Haddad. It is a one-man memoir play titled Hold Me in the Water, and in it, Haddad describes his first experience falling in love with a man. On a bare stage with just his walker, Haddad recounts the sexual, romantic, and ultimately heartbreaking arc of this months-long encounter, as well as the vulnerability of his first love as a gay man with cerebral palsy. Access is at the center of the production, as is true of much of Haddad's work. There are captions at the top of the proscenium, and he often includes visual descriptions of his gestures and setting. Moreover, there's the offer of a break room if anyone needs to step out, as well as performances that explicitly require face masking. Honestly, I could write a whole paper and then some on this play because it's such a rich and thoughtful production. But for the sake of this presentation, I would like to zero in on one scene at the end of the play that I see in dialogue with my research on the photos of Solomon and Coombs. At the conclusion of the play, apologies for any spoilers, it is already no longer in production, Haddad directly addresses the audience when he ruminates on the intimacies of access with his first love. Directly citing Mia Mingus's work, which I'll also cite it, specifically her popular essay about access intimacy, Haddad describes that feeling, quote, "when someone meets your needs without you having to ask, and you never have to wonder if your needs are too much for someone else," end quote. As Mingus puts it in access intimacy is the, quote, "kind of eerie comfort that you or a disabled self feels with someone on a purely access level. Sometimes it can happen with complete strangers, disabled or not, or sometimes it can be built over years. This queer feeling of access intimacy is rooted in care, trust, and understanding, oftentimes threading together other physical, emotional, and erotic intimacies. I end on Haddad's play as a powerful example of how performance, alongside visual aesthetics, is theorizing the power and pleasures of access and depicting private, queer and disabled intimacies in new forms in the public sphere. Thank you.
We have about 6 minutes officially, though there's nothing in this room immediately afterwards, but we shouldn't go too much longer than 4:15. So comments, questions, conversation, or any of my speakers? I guess you'll have to speak up or come up. If you can speak up, if anything's not heard, I'll translate it.
We were talking about PHP9. I am a disabled social services worker, and I have to do some PHP9.
And I always preface it by saying it's probably one of the worst surveys out there. And yet it's required, and it's a barrier to access because the questions are so terrible and so terribly written. And yet you need to answer it in order for me to give you the assistance that I'm not allowed to give you help if you don't answer these questions. And how do you see like that? You see the page 29 being changed through advocacy from the disabled community. You see we learn to just adapt to page 29 and other similar, like Unity 7, all of them, like you can't flatten a person's mental health. And yet all these surveys are designed to do exactly that. It's not really a question as much as like a jumble of thoughts that I've been having, and your presentation did a really great job of creating for some of them.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate that you talk about that with your clients openly. My psychiatrist always says, I don't treat numbers, I treat people. And that meant a lot to me because it's not really something I've experienced a lot. I think that's a great question / musing. And I think in my opinion, I would maybe even trace it all the way back to the DSM and looking at how are we constructing our mental health diagnoses and kind of like qualifying them, or because I feel like our screeners can't change until our understanding of what it means to be disordered changes.
But that's what that says, it's something to play. And like the idea of what is mental illness? Is mental illness real? So that it really is such an interconnected web of Michigan. So
Okay, in the back.
No, I'm still going to piggyback up because I'm also a social worker and clinician, and my hope, I think, in the field is that we move away from those to like we don't use those anymore because like there are many practitioners who don't use that and can suss out through rapport and relational practice whether someone's depressed and needs certain support. Where they're not answering like a list of questions and then giving someone a score, or they're not filling out a form, which is so manualized. So I think that it speaks also to sort of like the ways that, if I can try to articulate this like on the spot, like the ways that social services, the ways that basically like accessible mental health are so dictated by these kinds of policies that are the dictate because of funding, right? Like, and how that then, like, it's like certain populations are receiving those kinds of skills while others aren't and never see them. And that's like a huge problem. So I think that my goal would be that and or use them for training and like training relational stuff.
I think our moderator had to step out, but there's other people, I don't know who's stuck.
And I think become de facto moderator.
question for you. So how many you volunteer and work for primarily suicide hotlines in the US and abroad in Asia, studying how that deployment works? An issue that, in my experience, we found come up over and over again in these unpaid counselor positions is that liability and our not our clients, even unpaid good callers, detectors, awareness of liability and legal threats. Really shape our conversations. How are you how are you sort of like working with these as you're trying to develop a new model, especially considering the legal issues and the outcomes of community?
I think large social service or medical systems are really risk averse. And so we have to create things outside those systems that are willing to take risks and do relational work that might not look the same way or have outcomes that are as clearly measured. And I think there's also just an element of concept clarity as well about the roles of people in these systems and what we can offer each other, at what risks and what limits. This is part of what we're really grappling with. to do this work both inside and outside of formal systems. Lots of things.
Quickly, Justin, I wonder about the campiness of that first photograph of Robert Andy Coombs.
Yeah,
You read it kind of somberly,
I do.
but that Bob hat. When I think about like how Bob functions in the last 50 years, it's kind of this loud name
Yeah.
and Bob Sponge and Bob Newhart. It's like, I wonder if he's kind of being campy there.
I think there's a balance in camp for sure. I wasn't sure what to make of it, and that's maybe perhaps why I'm not bracketed. But there is something campy about it, but I do think at the same time, any campiness that he brings in is still minimized the way it's composed in the photo. Like his body is still quite small in comparison when you see the other photos compared where he is much more the focus of the photo, not the photo. But I like that mention of camping.
Maybe have time for one more comment. Yeah, you're gonna be the last question comment and then we'll go to our roundtable.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I really appreciate this space and all the speakers for talking, and like, especially on like the healthcare aspect of it, I'm going through my own process and journey with that, and it's exhausting, sometimes more exhausting than being. But I also really liked the images that I was great behind you. Yes,
Justin.
Okay, that you had brought up, and especially the Bob one.
Yeah.
Because also I noticed like he was like shorter than the rest of the crowd and did not have many high level to like see what I was going on. And so I like all of the nuances that you brought to those photos, the flags and the label weren't things that I needed to come onto. So I really appreciate that analysis. It's really interesting.
Great, that was a good last comment because it was, I appreciate this and I appreciate all, really lovely session. And we'll see you around at other things.
Stickers on